I extend a warm welcome to all of you attending this town hall, and especially to students who are joining us. I wish you all a happy fall as many of you start your semesters around the country. I want to express my deep appreciation to Aphasia Access and its board of directors for their strong support in hosting this town hall on good trouble and championing equity. I'm a proud member of this organization that I truly find refreshingly different, inspiring, innovative, and appreciative of different voices at the table. This organization has committed deeply to upend the status quo and how we think about aphasia, its impact on human beings and their families, the right of people with aphasia to a high quality of life and a high quality of care and to life participation. And also the need for clinicians and researchers to up their game and think big and bold. It's the exact kind of organization that can lead the way to applying this gritty, can-do mindset to challenge the inequities and discrimination brought on by racism in this beloved profession of ours. An organization that cares about life participation fundamentally and automatically for me cares about factors that greatly limit and diminish life participation and life potential. And we know that racism is one such very huge factor. I'm honored to be a moderator for this important reflective conversation with this distinguished group of panelists, leaders and unflinching advocates for equity for students, professionals, and clients who identify as Black, Indigenous, and persons of color or BIPOC. Dr. Martin Luther King said that we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And in these times, the angst and pain has been high, with hope being scarce. Today's conversation is about how we move forward collectively and decisively after bearing witness to what happened to George Floyd and many other Black persons like him, after bearing witness to the inequities once again for communities of color brought on by a global pandemic, and on confronting and taking down racism in our profession, in our organizations, our departments, our clinics, and our classrooms. Our goal is that attendees leave with some ideas for how you might champion equity within your sphere of influence, whether you teach a class, mentor student researchers, run an aphasia program, or lead within an organization. Our panelists today are long-term mentor Vicki Deal-Williams, devoted Chief Staff Officer for Multicultural Affairs for the American Speech Language and Hearing Association, Dr. Gloriajean Wallace, who is in the process of getting on, nationally known for her work in neurogenic communication disorders, an endowed professor, chair, and grad program director at Xavier University in Louisiana, Dr. Maria Munoz, distinguished aphasia researcher and author, bilingual SLP, former coordinator of ASHA's SIG 14 on cultural and linguistic diversity, and a professor at the University of Redlands in California. And Dr. Hia Datta, an expert on bilingualism, language disorders, and aphasia, currently an associate professor and undergrad program director at Malloy College in New York. Thank you so much for being here with me. The format we have chosen for this panel is to ask our panelists some thought-provoking questions and engage in an active dialogue, followed by taking your questions for about 15 minutes at the end before we bring this all to a wrap. Without further ado, here's my very first question. We are fully in the midst of a nationwide outcry for racial justice, and also what has quickly become a profession-wide outcry, that we have to do much more to look at racism right in the eye and strategize for how we dismantle it. What is a reflection or realization about championing equity that dominates your thinking right now?
I can get us started. There is a change management model by John Cotter, where he outlines 8 steps for change management. The very first step is creating a sense of urgency. I have for years been trying to figure out how to light a fire under our members, light a fire within the discipline to try to address things that all of us have known have been in place for a really long time. Well, lo and behold, urgency is here. I didn't have to do it. We now have that sense of urgency. But as we embark on trying to take advantage of the momentum that we have in this moment, I am, I guess, trying to make sure that whatever we do has sustainability. There are a whole lot of things that we can do. We've been doing things for years, but it doesn't mean that it's getting the results, the outcomes that we want. And when I think about and reflect on equity and social justice, I think about the fact that we have to change the systems that account for the lack of opportunity and access, and changing it in a way that works for a specific group in this instance. But targeting that group has implications for everyone. And ASHA's approach has been multiculturalism, to look across the spectrum to try to address equality. When we move from equality to equity, it's a whole different ballgame. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the distinction between equality, where everybody gets access to the same tools and resources and information, and equity, where it's customized. It's customized based on the needs of any particular individual or group in order to allow them to be successful. And that is something that is a lot different. I was about to say a little bit different. It's a lot different in terms of the way we need to think about what we do and how we do it.
If I may jump in. So Vicki, that was perfect, because you mentioned words like urgency and momentum. And if I'm being honest, I have to admit publicly that although I've always celebrated diversity, it's only in the past 3 months that I see myself immersed in actually making change actively. And that's because of this urgency and momentum that we have to keep embracing, or else we will lose the sustenance power that this has. So the realization that dominates my thoughts right now is it's more general, because I think the general can lead to the specifics. The way towards change and equity that are grossly overdue can come, in my opinion, from 3 things: to engage, to enrich, and to execute. So even in that order, in my opinion, to engage with others around us and talk to them about equity issues is key to embracing them. And these conversations need to happen with a wide range of people. You know, from the friend who thinks inequity ended with the demolition of slavery in 1865, because we have those friends, but we also have the friend who's protesting out there amidst COVID, right, despite their high health risk profile. So conversations need to be had with all of these people. But alongside, we also need to learn and read and enrich information we have access to about our country's history, about the present, and about even the direction the future is headed to if we do not make change, because that's a scary future. And finally, as you know, this is probably speaking to the choir, but in keeping this movement going, none of this will matter despite the best laid plans if you don't execute anything, right? And actions, as we all have been speaking through all the conversations we've had so far, definitely needs to happen at the systemic level, but it can happen with individuals as well. So I think all of this needs to happen. So if we're in this talk listening, we can be that person who can make the change by bringing that friend who thought equity happened in 1865 to this talk. That can be a change, but it can also be a change in leadership that lacks BIPOC representation. And there's so much lack of diversity in our leaderships, which then probably oppresses that individual change that we're trying to make, right? So I invite all of us in making commitments to these changes in our lives, in healthcare, in our classrooms, and our leadership.
Those are wonderful statements. I still feel like I have a lot more questions than answers, even though I've been dealing with issues of diversity my entire life. Some of my earliest memories relate to things related to things that happened to me because I am a Mexican American. I think though, in terms of kind of what an immediate questions I'm having and thoughts I'm having, focus a lot on culture. I think we talk a lot about race, which is an important part of this, but underlying that and connected to that is the whole issue of culture and how we talk about the differences in how we view the world that come out of our cultural experiences and our cultural learning, and how the cultural conflicts and mismatches are at a root of a lot of the kinds of problems that we're seeing. And I'm trying to figure out how to talk about that. And it's really hard because we don't really have language for that. The closest I'm kind of coming is this recognition that in the United States, we have a very white-centric cultural expectation. And that defines, what we think is important, what we value, the priorities we set, how we look at an experience like Breonna Taylor, and how do we react to that those are all very culturally determined, and that the kind of base culture is very much a white culture. And I think we have to figure out ways to start talking about those differences in worldview and recognizing that those in power, and it all comes down to power when we're talking about racial injustice, how people in power need to start recognizing that there's a different way to view the world, and it's not wrong, it's just different. And we need to start being open to seeing the world from different points of view. And I think it really has to start from, I'm also playing with this idea of bottom up. Do we make change and hope we change attitude, or we do top down, try to change attitude and hope behavior changes? And I think we really have to start thinking, I think bottom up. I think it's easier to capture a change. So like for me, I'm talking about how do we change how we do advising to benefit students of color? And I think that's an easier change to make and construct than look at your implicit bias and let's fix that, because we know the research shows you can't really change implicit bias. So I'm starting to move to the idea that let's look at specific things that we can change that will open up people's worldview to other things. And then from that bottom up perspective, start changing implicit bias. And because really implicit bias, I'm starting to think of bias as kind of a reflex, just like, you hit somebody's knee, the leg goes up. That bias is so hard to change because it's a reflex, it's a learned behavior. You see something, you think of it a certain way because that's all you've done. And it's so automatic, you don't really even realize that you're doing it. And so how can we start? Let's change behavior. And from there, I think the mind will start to go with it. So those are the things I'm kind of playing around in my head, and they're very nebulous, but maybe they'll take me somewhere that will change the world. We'll see.
Yeah, I heard such great stuff in that response to this very first question. And I know Gloriajean hasn't been able to join in yet, but I know one of the things when I got to spend some time in conversation with all the panelists, and Gloriajean had said to me, I'm just happy that we're having all these conversations, but will change happen? And so she articulated much of what you all were saying, more questions than answers. Yes, there's an urgency. And, we are talking and reflecting and learning, but are we going to take actions from that moment? One point that you made, Maria, near the end of your remarks reminds me of this old D.H. Lawrence quote that said, the eye cannot see what the mind does not know. And so I think that there is some value, even though this is painful, but when disclosure happens, and yes, there's a whole debate about there has to be a culture of safety to permit disclosure, rather than disclosure meaning that this is a failure on the part of the person, that they had this problem. That there's something about that the more sharing there is, this is probably the first time that with regards to racism that we're being confronted with it so blatantly, that many SLPs are starting to know what this must be like for those who endure it. You're no less an SLP, because you have fought through discrimination and racism. So it's definitely, it's definitely time for change and concerted effort. And I want to direct in that spirit this next question to Vicki. So just days after George Floyd was murdered, you wrote what was perhaps a piece of writing that really connected with lots of people who were just in pain. And it was hard hitting. So this was a blog you wrote for ASHA Leader Live. And if the attendees have not seen it, even if you just Google it outside of the ASHA website, it comes up immediately. So you wrote, and I quote, "We have to remove the proverbial knees on the necks of persons from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds pursuing careers in our professions." You added that it was not a surprise that this underrepresentation exists and that you view this type of underrepresentation really as holding our profession back from breathing new life into service delivery, to enhance student preparation, and to advance research and innovation. I've known you a long time, and you're one of the most tactful diplomatic leaders I've had the pleasure of working with. And this is so powerful to me, so direct coming from you. Can you kickstart our thinking about what you consider to be the top reasons for this pervasive underrepresentation?
Yeah, and I probably should put that blog in context. I actually wrote that originally about health and education disparities related to COVID. And then George Floyd died. And as I started looking around, it was more stream of consciousness, and I just started adding to what I had already come up with. And I think for me, because I have spent as long as I have addressing some of these issues within our professions, what I saw was the benefits of diversity being diminished, foregone, without really addressing key issues related to how we get greater representation into our discipline. To me, there are really three reasons that underrepresentation exists. One, people don't know about our professions. I've been at ASHA for going on 32 of the last 36 years, 37. We have been, for the entire 37 years that I've spanned being connected to the national office, there have been efforts to increase what it is that people know about who we are and what we do. We now have 211,000 members. I found out yesterday there were 41,000 when I first started at ASHA. And we were trying to push these messages out. We're at 211,000. The advantage we have now, to me, is that there are more of us that people know. So it is easier to find some connection that people have to one of the 211,000 of us. So they know somebody who is a speech language pathologist, the lady across the street, or the man who they saw at the coffee shop every Tuesday. So there is a greater sense of the professions, but not within communities of color. It hasn't seeped into those communities at the same level that it has. So the growth that we might naturally see isn't occurring. So that's when people don't know who we are, what we do, what it means to be a speech language pathologist or even an audiologist. A second thing is that people are discouraged or not encouraged to pursue our professions. The listening sessions that ASHA's held the last several weeks brought some of that to very clear light, that there have been intentional efforts on many individuals' parts to make sure that people of color have not gotten into the professions. Either they don't look at them, don't think about them, they talk them out of it. They don't see individuals who might pursue diversity aren't seeing themselves. So we know diversity begets diversity. So when they don't see it, they think, okay, well, that's not for me because there's nobody like me there. And then the last one would be that we have barriers to entry. There are standardized tests in our way. The SAT, the GRE, the praxis exam. We already know standardized tests and the impact that they have on our communities, but we put them in place. The years of school, the full-time versus part-time options that, well, part-time, the option that you don't really have once you get to the point where you need to participate in clinical study. Bias in decision-making, self-fulfilling prophecies, and low expectations, all of those are real barriers to entry.
I'd like to add, Vicki, thank you. That was a great start. And thank you for your blog post. I read that and thought it was just a great statement of what was going on. Just to add, kind of build on what Vicki was just saying, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is the ultimate attribution error, which is the idea that people within your cultural influence, you're more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt. If they do something well, it's because they're intelligent. If they do something poorly, oh, something happened. People outside of your cultural experience, when they do something well, it's like, oh, they got lucky. And when they do something poorly, it's a reflection of their abilities. And I do see that play out with our students of color, where they don't do well on an exam and they're one exam and they're suddenly being counseled out of the major because, well, you know, you're probably just not a good fit. And I was shocked at how many students reported that at the ASHA listening sessions, that that's still happening today. While if a white student, because again, most of our professors are white, if a white student made that same error, they would be, oh, you know, it's, you know, you can do better next time. Yeah, how can I help you? I know you're capable. While with the student of color, it's you know, you probably aren't a good fit, not factoring things like maybe they're a first generation, maybe they're also working full time, maybe they were taking care of an elderly parent. There's all these other things that might have impacted performance. So I think, again, we need to start looking at our own biases and how those influence the decisions and recommendations that we make. So that's what I've been thinking a lot, because I do think that has a big influence.
And if I may jump in to agree with Maria, not from an instructor or program director perspective, from a student perspective, that, you know, when I was a student, it almost felt like it was wrong to do that, to speak up for the person who shared your culture, that you were playing favorites. Oh, we should not carry that bias with ourselves as instructors, but that's not true. That's why we need the diversity, because then everybody can champion for what they, you know, what they can see as lived experiences, right? That's not even a term I knew when I came in 2000. That was not a thing. So I truly appreciate what you just said, Maria and Vicki, as well.
Yeah, and I will agree that, you know, it's actually a place of power to be able to even reflect on your own experience and go back and say, you know, that was totally awful that happened to me, or to even think about, I see this playing out and I can't sit quiet. You have to come to a place of power. And I think that is another place why these conversations are essential, because we need to bring our students and professionals and even our clients and communities of color, like, to bring them to a place of power, to be able to tell us what we've gotten wrong. It's without calling that, without calling attention to that, I don't know that we can start to fix it. So I wanted to let everybody know amongst our panelists and our attendees that Dr. Gloriajean Wallace is joining us via Jess Campbell's phone. We've had some issues with getting her in, but I know she's with us and will participate that way. Are you here, Dr. Wallace?
Yeah, I'm kind of going in and out and they have to reconnect me for some reason, but I'm getting the gist of what you're saying, and I hope that I'll be able to dovetail and jump in when you're ready for me to. Thank you.
Perfect, welcome. You know, for my next question, I want to start turning our attention to thinking about teaching and the critical work that happens in the classroom. Certainly, Aphasia Access has taken on that challenge by focusing significantly on how do we improve the teaching of aphasia. But related to that, it's often been said that curriculum is a major vehicle for social change. And I know from what I've seen in the last many years, our colleagues in education, ethnic studies, disability studies have moved very quickly towards talking about equity pedagogy, culturally sustaining pedagogies. And I don't hear those conversations in our discipline very much. So that's something I think about, but I'm asking the panelists, what would you want to see happen differently in the teaching of aphasia or of multicultural issues in SLP, knowing what you know about deep-seated racial inequities in our profession, as you've all just shared, and also in the world outside?
I can start. So the first point is, you know, what we've been talking about in terms of the models we bring to the classroom in putting aphasia in context. The deficit models that we, you know, and I hold myself responsible for all of these things too, just to be clear. So recently I've actually resorted to looking into the life participation approach that Aphasia Access champions, as well as the International Classification for Functional Disability and Health, the ICF model, because it helps the clinicians view persons with aphasia holistically, right? We all know this. Now, what is the benefit of that? Now, reflecting on how we invite our students to think about aphasia is very important, especially in light of this conversation, as Nidhi was just saying, because in my view, at least, if we use the deficit model, we can definitely still address dialect and bilingualism, right? When we are teaching assessment of syntax, say. But only when we view our client beyond the deficits, and when we view them beyond that long-term goal of reaching the 5-word utterance, can we bring race and equity into the classroom. So that's why this is so important. And I also want to make the point that the ICF model or the life participation approach does not take away from the science, the theory, the linguistics of aphasia, but it keeps the client as a person in the center of it all. And that's a very important piece of understanding who these people are. The next thing that I think is important to think about is actually sort of an offshoot of a point that Maria said. So while you were speaking, Maria, I made 2 graphics because I like graphics. So to me, this is the model that exists that you were talking about, where the standard is Eurocentric, right? That's the big circle. This is what we teach. I do too. So the first thing I just mentioned, I've sort of, you know, started embracing, but the other 2 things I will say I haven't and I have to. So this is what we say, that the Eurocentric piece is the key. We learn language acquisition from this point of view. We learn typical language disorders, aphasia, whatever. And then culture 1, culture 2, culture 3, culture X are all satellites of this. But what I think we should do is this, of course, that there are various cultures and the Eurocentric cultures are part of that. And yes, we have a ton of literature on that, but that's just because of this. So, you know, it's sort of a cycle. And I do think that how we bring standardized American English into the classroom is important. Are we saying that this is standard American English, not standardized, which means this is the norm and the others are dialects that are satellites? Or as instructors, we're referring to all languages and dialects as variants, of each other. And I recently attended a conference on advancing African American English linguistics, which was great. And there was discussion about when we are bringing in dialectal variation, when in the 14 to 15 week period. Are we doing it towards the end as if this is, okay, even if we missed it, it would be okay? Or are we presenting it alongside the standardized English issues, right? So to speak to the point of Maria again, languages also play into this, and cultures as much, and all of this. And the last thing I'll mention, which I found important and recently realized it's urgent, at least according to me, is how our students, as students, student clinicians, and or novice clinicians in the field should address racism. How they should address racism, should they face it from their clients, from instructors, or clinical supervisors. I feel we put a lot of pressure in our multicultural class about how students should be professional and empathize and be culturally humble and see the client's point of view. But I've heard stories where clinicians have been interacted in a fashion that is just not acceptable, right? So how are we training our students to balance their professional compassion, their cultural humility with their right to be anti-racist? And that's a question I'd love to pose to both Vicki and Maria. And the last piece that I've realized 3 months ago when I was teaching this class, so I teach the multicultural issues class in my program, and I have a piece in it about racism. And I had that going when George Floyd died. And I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. Racism as part of a module in multiculturalism is not enough. That needs to be a clinical training for everybody across. In fact, that needs to be a core, we have general education, colleges graduating students with core values. That's where it needs to be. And if we can't get there, then we need to have modules where our students learn to be anti-racist, going forward, aside from the multicultural piece and the cultural competency piece that's, a ASHA requirement. So those are my takes on the classroom.
I have the luxury of teaching both a neurogenics course and a multicultural course. So that gives me a little bit more flexibility on how I cover topics like aphasia. I will say my primary challenge is time when it comes to the aphasia course, because I cover aphasia and TBI and right hemisphere speech. I first need students to understand what aphasia is, and just getting them there takes time, and it doesn't leave me a lot of time to start thinking about how things change when you start bringing up issues of diversity. And so, but I still think that scattered throughout a class, you can provide examples of how this would look different or how this would be based on the patient. The one thing I've been focusing a lot on lately is the idea of helping clinicians understand that what you do, let's say an assessment or intervention with aphasia, isn't starting from scratch. It's like what the normal is aphasia stuff, and well, then there's cultural stuff, and hopefully the bilingual people do that, because I don't know what to do. And what I'm trying to really focus on now is recognizing that the basic structure, your process for assessment and intervention, all you have to do is figure out how do you adjust that. So for example, with assessment, you have a process. You review the record, you interview the patient, you find out what their priorities are, you establish priorities, you test those priorities. So in there, figuring out, okay, where do I jog to account for cultural and linguistic diversity? Well, you ask different questions. I tell people, you need to ask every patient, do they have experience with a language other than English? Because if you say, are you bilingual? They may say no, because they don't feel like they have enough proficiency to consider themselves bilingual. But in fact, they have a language, and when you have brain damage, all kinds of weird stuff happens. So I had a former student come to me and say, my brother had a traumatic brain injury and he's speaking French. This was a very mainstream white student. Her family grew up in the South. he had had high school French, and he had brain injury, and suddenly all he was speaking French for a while. It didn't last long, but if you had asked him or his family, is he bilingual, they would have said no. And so they would have labeled that as jargon aphasia, and it would have been wrong. And so I think really thinking about, it's not starting from scratch. It's taking what you already do and tweaking it a little bit, and that's going to benefit everybody. Multicultural doesn't have to be separate from your standard practice. Multicultural practice is good practice. So when I talk about non-biased assessment, I have used that with hearing impaired kids. I've used that with visually impaired children. I've used that with bilingual children. I've used that with low SES. There's all kinds of reasons that you might need to make adjustments that aren't dependent on race. So I think if we start viewing not speech therapy, normal speech therapy, quote unquote, and then diverse speech therapy as two separate things, and recognizing that if you do good speech therapy and keep your eyes open and your ears open, it's going to be good for everybody. The number of students who can actually, with whom, I'm thinking kids, just because we use standardized tests with kids, but the number of people with whom you can actually use a standardized test is actually really limited, because most people don't fit the norming sample in any meaningful way. And so I think multicultural practice is fundamentally just good practice. So I'd like to see us teach that to students.
Absolutely. We've just shared so many great things here. I want to see if Gloriajean was trying to say something. I might have heard her.
Okay, yeah. Am I on now? Can you hear me? Am I on? Can somebody hear me?
You're good.
Okay, all right. So, boy, I have a lot to say. I've been a speech pathologist for 44 years, predominantly working as a student.
Jess, I'm not able to hear Gloriajean.
I think we have a bad connection. Give me one moment, please.
Okay. And while we're waiting to get Gloriajean back on, I'm going to have the panelists start to think as we're talking about, you know, these nuggets for classroom teaching. I also want to get you thinking about, you know, how we do clinical work in university clinics, in our training programs, and in community-based aphasia rehab programs. So from an equity-minded stance, what do you think we need to do better or more of when we're designing clinical programs and offering services? And I think Gloriajean might be back.
Okay, I'm on. Okay, what a tease, folks. Hey. Okay, this is the first time I've been asked, probably the first time there's been an aphasia forum like this. And I have been a speech pathologist for 44 years, 3 years in predominantly white institutions as a student, 5 years teaching in predominantly white institutions. I had, not 5 years, but 5 different universities, 2 different institutions, white institutions as a postdoc, and then 2 predominantly HBCUs as a professor. So I have a lot of different perspectives in terms of speech pathologist, researcher, professor, administrator, and a aphasiologist. So thank you. And I want to first off commend Aphasia Access. There are several different, there were 5 or 6 different premier aphasia groups. And you were the first one to host a forum like that. And that says a lot, because Aphasia Access is the premier organization for life participation. You all tout the fact that all people with aphasia matter. So the fact that you are now hosting this to emphasize not just all people, but you're cognizant of the fact that some people seem not to, and not intentionally, but seem not to be included in that all people with aphasia matters. You're trying to make a difference by pulling out and saying Black people with aphasia matter, Hispanic Latino people with aphasia matter, Asian folks with aphasia matter, people who are bilingual and have aphasia matter. Everybody with aphasia matters, but we have to pull out these groups. So I thank you so much for having this forum, which gives us an opportunity to do this, to talk about this. And what I would suggest is that I would love to see an inter-organizational dialogue, so that perhaps with Aphasia Access being the premier folks, all about life participation and equality for everybody, perhaps this is the perfect group to host an inter-organizational dialogue with ANCDS, who also have very sensitive members. And if there's time, I've been very intimately involved with that group, and I can tell you some of the things that they started years back, and we need some momentum in all these groups, but they have certainly tried some things. There's ASHA SIG 2, there's Mbasla. People may not even know that Mbasla is a neurosig group that goes back probably 30, 35 years. Clinical Aphasiology Conference folks and Academy of Aphasia. Some are more user-friendly for people of color than others, but I would suggest that perhaps Aphasia Access consider having an inter-organizational dialogue so that we can have a true needs assessment. A needs assessment, like an aphasia summit is what I'm talking about, with tracks, people with aphasia, you know, what do they need? People of color who have aphasia, are there special interests that they have that none of us perhaps are cognizant of, because many people with aphasia don't service us. They don't come to us, or they don't last long, simply because of a whole myriad of reasons. Probably we need a whole other session to talk about that. But clinicians, researchers, faculty, administrators, and then our precious students, the undergrads, the grads, the master students, the PhDs, and the docs. Who's there to help those folks network? Do they have issues? And I've sat in on forums, and I've lived experiences. I have war stories that I won't tell you today, but I can empathize that at every single level, there are issues, perhaps unconscious issues, but they're real. And they're actually, to the extent that I don't really see much of a difference than I did 40 years ago. But it's really refreshing to see a premier aphasia association trying to start a dialogue about all this. Now, in terms of teaching, someone mentioned teaching. Hold on, I'm just going to mention teaching since that was your last question, and I'm going to hush for a bit. But the teaching, I wanted to say that we teach ICF model and personalization. That's what we do. And so for me, for instance, in my aphasia class and whatnot. Well, first let me mention the Vicki Deal. Vicki is there, and Vicki and Lorraine Cole and Vince Rodriguez, and some of you may not be too young to even know about. They used to host a huge Island, Georgia forum where they brought people from all over the country to talk about how diversity relates to particular areas of represented, somebody who others, etc. And they talk about how to blend in. The very question, they taught people how to blend in diversity with their content area. And they taught people that you must do it. They were saying that way, some of those suggestions that people contributed way back when. Some pretty much the same. So for instance, in a picture class, when you weave in, of course you talk about content, but then you weave in examples so that the students have an opportunity to practice and play around with what they're learning. So you can consciously be able to give a case. So we don't think about, oh, this is a rough opportunity to give examples using cases from diverse backgrounds, because the world is diverse. We think to give cases from cultures and races and ethnicities and et cetera, languages that we are familiar with. That's perhaps the issue. And then when we look at the standards, they say you should cover it. The question is, why is it that when people survey speech pathologists to ask how comfortable are you with diversity, and I invite you to look at the literature. All the studies say, speech pathologists say that they're not comfortable, even though our standard says that it's supposed to be covered. I suggest that it's because it's to be covered and we have academic freedom, et cetera, but there are no guidelines. And so people don't have any idea oftentimes, and some of my colleagues tell me this, about where to start, what to cover, et cetera, et cetera. And so with such a loose framework, it's going to be very difficult to know how and what to include. In the absence of that, I suggest that you use a variety of cases with a variety of scenarios, simply so that your cases represent real world instead of the tendency to have them represent what you're familiar with. All lives matter, and if that's the case, then that means Black lives matter, Hispanic lives matter, Asian lives matter, et cetera, et cetera. People who are bilingual, their lives matter, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then the other piece is, you learn about content. That's important in terms of, well, what's culture, what's the language and all that of certain groups of people without stereotyping. But then beyond that, you have to have a sensitivity. So I learn about stuff in the textbook, but what if I get a person from a culture that I didn't learn about in my classroom? What do I do? Or what if I get someone and I don't speak their language? What do I do? How do I use an interpreter? And even the fact of, if I use an interpreter, is the person getting the same quality of service that if I just simply referred them to someone who spoke their own language? So there are a lot of issues there, and there are a lot of issues that we really haven't addressed. So is doing something better than doing nothing? I question that. So we need more research just to look into some of these, but there's just a whole myriad of topics. One last thing I'm going to say is that, why are we a profession? What are we doing this for? We're doing this because ultimately, if we're a researcher, a teacher, whatever, our ultimate goal is that we want to provide quality services to cases who have aphasia in our instance. So in order to do that, we have to have people in the profession. So who's in the profession? We need all people at the table if we're going to represent a diverse world, a diverse caseload. We need everybody's opinion, not just opinions from certain groups of people. So then that brings us into the leadership notion, which if we have a summit, perhaps we can address that. Who are the leaders? Are they diverse? Do we have members? Well, so what if we have members if they're not active members? Why aren't they active? There's a whole host of things I think that we need to address in terms of recruitment. How early can we start? Probably very early, as Vicki earlier. And then once we matriculate into the point of undergrad, because we know that people of color disproportionately have poverty issues sometimes, not always, believe me, not always, but sometimes. And what we do is we offer people scholarships and that sort of thing. And then when they get in, is it good enough to have them come in just so we can, when we do our CAA report, say, oh, we have X number of diverse people? But are we actually able to say, we have X number of diverse people and we are supporting them in the proper kind of way? And what does that mean? What does that mean if you're in a predominantly Black school? What does it mean if you're in a predominantly white school? Maybe something very different in terms of the level of support you're able to give. Why is that? So there are so many different questions. And the ultimate thing is that once you get somebody successfully out and they're practicing, how do you get someone who's an R&B Holland? And I'm picking on her because she's my favorite. Yes, it's done, when they have their
You're breaking up a little bit again, Gloriajean, but thank you so much. You gave us so many nuggets and you actually helped us even segue to our next question. But I really think that two things that you brought up. One was about, it's not just about the numbers, but what happens when the numbers do get to our doorstep, into our programs, or even into our clinical programs for that matter. It's been said for some time that when we think about clinical programs, it's one thing to say, we've got a few or 1/3 of my aphasia group is racially and ethnically diverse, and it's a different thing to say we think about culturally responsive program development or strategic outreach to these communities of color. I had a very powerful example about 7 years ago, and we were doing some work with Black clients with aphasia, and we're out in the community. And you know, many of the clients, there was a certain, you know, veiled and dignified anger at us as clinicians and researchers, where they wanted to know, you know, things were said such as 3 generations of my family have been impacted by stroke and aphasia. Where have you all been? And they kind of pointed out very powerfully, you know, your university sits here a few miles away, and you know, this is the first time you're here talking about this topic. So I assure you, you know, my clinician researchers and students who are listening in, that our communities of color are thinking about that. They do think about what we're doing and what we're not doing. And we have to meet clients and communities of color, many of whom are disproportionately impacted by stroke, aphasia, neurological disorders like Alzheimer's disease. But this is not reflected in our work in research and publications and conferences. And I think that conversations like this is where some of that starts to change. So I want to kick it back to the panel to see if you have any thoughts you want to throw us our way about designing clinical programs or thinking about university training clinics. And then I am absolutely coming back to Gloriajean's point about leadership and equity of voices at the table.
So I'd like to share an example of thinking outside the box when it comes to clinical training program. We actually had used this in a double duty fashion. I participated in this research project that embraced a life participation and interprofessional education and collaboration model. And this project, I would say, made way for equity in communication beyond deficit, disability, dialect, and oral language. And you'll see what I mean. 3 years ago, a graduate student at that time, Carrie-Ann Scaracho, came to me, wanted to do a project with aphasia. So my colleagues, Susan Alamanti and Dr. Laura Wood, and I got together mentoring that student in what became a project where we delivered drama therapy and speech therapy simultaneously to, at that time, 5 individuals with aphasia. This project involved something, a model called Coactive Therapeutic Theater Model, which is Laura's model, who's a licensed drama therapist. And she, along with her collaborator, Dave Marr, scripted a play involving values and lived experiences of the 5 participants with aphasia. And get this, this was my favorite part. She was able to incorporate individual communication goals into the script. I mean, I was beside myself. The first year we ran this, there were 5 people, and we ended up, the next year we did it, we had 6 participants, and diversity involved representing 3 different acquired neurogenic diagnoses, 3 races, 5 cultural backgrounds, 4 dialects, and 6 languages between just those 6 people. And the journey, it changed all of us. It involved 10 sessions of the drama therapy and the speech therapy leading up to the final therapeutic theater production. And the day of the therapeutic theater production changed experiences of 80+ members who actually watched this live. They viewed aphasia and people with aphasia in a light they'd never seen before. What was my favorite part was that these participants were able to empower themselves, respective of what their background was, using the one modality they felt defeated in, communication, see? And we could do this because we involved more than just what we consider as traditional speech therapy. So there was the arts and the drama therapy and speech therapy, which transcended benefits of just speech therapy alone and embraced diversity in multiple domains. So I really invite all of us to think about outside the box experiences for our students. And all the students who were involved in the project, not just from speech, but also from mental health counseling, were of white background. So I think one of the things that we need to think about as being involved in clinical training is how to get these students more comfortable with diversity, because that's the problem, right? What Gloriajean so rightfully said, and she has said in her publications that clinicians report they're not comfortable. So how are we going to get comfortable? Only when we meet people who are not like us, right? So I think these are ways probably to do it or to think about it.
I'll
I'm
add
sorry, can
on
I
to
just,
that. Oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I just would like to share a couple pictures of it. It'll just take a second. So here's one, and here's another picture. This is all on stage, and this is sort of the whole team doing a Q&A. Thank you.
What a wonderful example, Hia. Thank you for sharing. And I think this is true too, that sometimes the creative arts have a way of breaking through. So these universal languages that we have of art and music and creative performance really can help have a different power to recruit clients that are diverse and might be looking for a different role in life participation than straight up impairment focused interventions. We're quickly running out of time. This is such a fabulous discussion. I want to get our fearless leader Vicki's help in starting to do a little bit of wrap up and take questions from our audience. So Vicki, you and I have had so many fabulous conversations since all of this started, but recently you shared with me that the current plight of the profession reminds you of an HGTV special where someone has this great old house, lots of character. It's old, all right, but the foundation is solid. And yet you learn that the entire wiring of the house is dysfunctional and has to be completely replaced. This is such an image in my mind and has, I just need you to give it to us straight. Can you tell our attendees and people listening in, what did you mean exactly after 37 years on this journey? And what are the marching orders you want to give us?
I think my marching orders would be look behind your walls, look under your rugs, look into your plumbing, your electricity. That analogy, I've been ODing on HGTV because it's the one mindless pleasure that I have right now. But the analogy really stems from the fact that when people go into those situations and they're remodeling those homes, they do so without knowing what's behind the walls, what's under the floors. And when they want to start moving walls and changing things up, they uncover things. We are at a point where we've uncovered some things. And the only way that we can deal with them is to fix them. So we could try to cover them up. We could try to put down another layer of flooring on top of the asbestos floor asbestos tile that's under there, but it's gonna make us sick. So we have to rip it all up, get the abatement folks in, get all the asbestos out. And the only way to do that is to really start asking ourselves and answering some really tough questions. I think this gets at the point that Hia made at the very beginning when she was talking about execution, because we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we are currently doing and how are we doing it? Who's involved? Who's missing? Who's not here? And what's in their way? Why aren't they here? How do we get them here? What is it that we can do to engage those individuals? Whether we're talking about case studies in our courses, whether we're talking about individuals that we're bringing into our clinics, we have to ask those kinds of questions. We have to look at admissions or intake, whichever setting you're applying them to. We have to look at scheduling. We have to look at courses themselves and the content. We have to look at everything. This is our time to evaluate and assess, lift those things up, see what's there, and fix them. If we don't, we will fail to lose the momentum. We'll fail to take advantage of the momentum, and we will not be able to sustain this change, and nothing will come of all of this work. This is the time, and this is our opportunity, and we are the ones, all of us collectively are the ones who have to go to work and make a difference.
Thank you so much. That was just such a call to action. And folks around the country have been saying that. We have been doing inquiry. We have been doing reflecting. The time right now is really to start moving into actionable items and start to look at low-hanging, high-hanging, and all kinds of fruit. I do have a bunch of questions coming in from the group, and I'm going to take a couple of these. So one of the questions that Wendy Greenspan asks, she says this is a very important discussion about education. Can the speakers touch on issues of anti-racism in the context of aphasia programs and aphasia groups? So specifically, she's asking if you have suggestions for how SLPs interact with BIPOC persons with aphasia.
I'm sorry.
I would say, oh,
could she rephrase it or repeat it or something? I'm not quite understanding.
Wendy is asking about any suggestions we have for how we might better interact as SLPs with BIPOC and diverse persons with aphasia.
Okay.
I can take a piece of this because you all know me, I am not an aphasia expert. But the one thing that I would suggest in some of the things that I've been reading and interacting with lately, we've been talking about the need for us to have conversations and to talk with people who look like us and think like us, which we do on a regular basis, to talk to people who look like us but don't think like us, to talk to people who don't look like us and think like us, and people who don't look like us and don't think like us. And I would assume, and again, I'm making an assumption here because I am not an aphasia expert, but I would assume that if you took that and put that in the context of your aphasia groups and tried to build that in to give some folks those same kinds of experiences, and I think this goes to Maria's point earlier about multicultural practice is just good practice. It's building on the need for us to interact across cultures, across experiences, and give people that opportunity so that they can start to recognize where racism exists, what the impact is, and how to address it.
Building on that, I'd like to add, you got to be okay with being uncomfortable. You got to be okay with making mistakes, because you're going to start to be challenged to see the world a different way. One example I have, and this was a group of Spanish-speaking Mexican-American couples, and it happened that it was a bilingual aphasia support group, but it happened to be that day that we were all Spanish speakers, and they started talking about the men. It was all men who had aphasia, and they started talking about how they missed the role that they had as the head of the household and being the man of the family, and not in any real negative way, but in a way that really was a very traditional machismo, I'm in charge of my family kind of way. That for me, being an Americanized Mexican, was kind of uncomfortable because it's like, no, women should be able to do more, but that's not what they needed. And that's not what they wanted to communicate. And I had to be okay with stepping back from my own view of the world and say, this is how you feel, and that's okay. And you miss that, and that's okay. Even though inside of me, everything was screaming, don't treat women that way. It was not anything particularly negative, but it was definitely different from my worldview. And I was uncomfortable, and I had to be okay with that and go follow them to where they needed to be and not dictate based on what I was comfortable. And I think that you got to be okay with being uncomfortable. And that's not always a strength for speech pathologists.
And I have something to say. Can they hear me?
Yes, we can.
So, and that digs to the topic that people refer to as unconscious bias. And so I think it's important for speech pathologists, as with everyone, to have training. And I'm just thinking, I conducted a study with 20 different American folks, and it was a life participation study. And the bottom line is, I won't put all the results, but the bottom line is, I said, well, do you feel supported? And amazingly, so many of them didn't. And I think they felt comfortable with me because I was African American, as they were. And so they kind of spewed out lots of things. Like I said, how come you weren't at the group, the groups around town? Because I've been, looking for subjects for this research. And they said, well, I don't feel comfortable because people don't look like me, and it's just a different culture, and I don't feel right. They're not doing the kinds of things I like to do. And then other people said transportation. So when we look at stroke and figure that ASHA says we have a role in prevention, then we really need to be out there marching around, helping people not to have a second and third stroke, and to find them and then pool them and find out what is it that you want. And as Vicki was saying, there's silent voices out there, voices who have not been welcomed, and voices who are afraid to speak up or who don't know how to speak up to have their wishes known to everyone, to us as speech pathologists. So there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done by reaching to community and finding people, even because you may not find these folks or a lot of these folks from diverse backgrounds in the traditional ways that we find subjects and we find cases, for group and whatnot.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, Gloriajean, that there's something about, we own this idea in aphasia programming. We always like to say people vote with their feet. But I was just making a comment to somebody who responded in the chat, one of my students, and people vote that with their feet is also emblematic of how included they feel, right? That is our watch. If clients do not feel comfortable in our clinical research trials, coming to our aphasia groups, it means that we're not doing the right kinds of outreach and convening, the right kinds of conversations where they are truly person-centered and community-centered, so that we adapt what we do in terms of aphasia programs. There are so many questions, everybody, that are just coming in. I'm gonna try to take a couple. I know that this is a conversation that really exceeds time bounds. So one other attendee asks, and this is for all of you, and it's an anonymous attendee who says, going back to the conversation about our profession's culture of power and white supremacy, and connecting to Dr. Datta's point about how to train students to balance being compassionate and humble, as well as anti-racist. And the person, this attendee asks, how do I push for my administration to be responsive to conversations like the one we're having today, when they are already inundated with action items and managing day to day? So this person is just articulating, we are so extremely close to being burned out right now. So how do we not lose sight of envisioning this more just future?
I would say you find like people who are on this line right this minute, find some comrades to support you in what you're trying to do. Because you can't do anything alone, and it's not going to be speedy quit. We're picking up momentum and we just keep going, but don't get discouraged because there's lots to be done. And so we can't lose one person. We've got to gain, thousands to make this thing work and get improved. So please reach out to people, and administrators, everybody's busy, and I'm not speaking because I don't know what level you're talking about. But yeah, I'd say just find someone and just bear in there. And thank you for being here today. That says a lot. This is a lot of time away from your busy schedule. So you're contributing just by being here.
I wanted to totally agree with Gloriajean that, if you can't find comrades within your department, you can find them outside your department, outside your university. We are a whole community of speech pathologists, take your pick. And in fact, I was able to connect with people by just being on these webinars from these furious chats that happen on the side. But I wanted to also mention the other question that came up, Nidhi, about the clinician. And it's not a solution I offer, but a very inspiring story that I heard in the first listening session that ASHA held. And maybe a lot of you already know it, but I'd like to remind you of it. So it was the first story that was shared was by a speech pathologist who's been in the profession for 9 years, and in her, I think recently, perhaps in her practice, she encountered a patient who told her that she was surprised that the clinician was Black. So the clinician asked, whose name, forgive me, I don't remember, is what is surprising about that? Yes, I am your SLP. So the patient said that she had never met anybody who was educated who was Black. And if it were me, well, first of all, my hair was rising up on my skin. And if it were me, I don't know what I would have done. But this amazing SLP said to her she first told her patient that she was the one who trained everybody in the department. So yes, she's that SLP in the hospital. And she told her supervisor that that patient be given to no one else, that she is going to work with the patient. And, you know, the journey was made, and the patient was able to see that not only her, millions of people who are Black are educated. But that happened only because this SLP had the courage. So as students and, you know, new people in the field, even though we might feel afraid, I think that discomfort that we are asking everyone to feel, we have to feel it too and move forward.
I just want to add one little piece too, and that's to be strategic. ASHA's been inundated with feedback about what we should do, which is great to get member feedback, except when you have to respond to 800 people. And I do literally mean 800 people. But all that feedback has led us to a point where we've been able to try and figure out, okay, of all the things we could do, where do we start? But it goes back to my point earlier about sustainability. The only way we can sustain this, and we have to, because this has to be a lifelong, continuous effort, is if we build it into the systems that exist for addressing issues. We could come up with a task force or a committee. We could come up with a list of things that we're going to try to do, but building it into ASHA's strategic planning system is going to make the difference. You are going to have to get back to the question, to build this into existing pieces that exist within your university and align yourself and latch on to whatever efforts there are to make change is the only way that you're going to be able to sustain these efforts. Even if it means that you just get a little piece done now, there's some other low-hanging fruit that you can get to in the meantime, but latch on to that one piece that's strategic and then start to make, get that done, get that outcome, and then you can ride the wave of that outcome because you have evidence that there's a difference to be made by making some of these changes.
I know we need to move on, but just real quick, I get being tired. I've spent a lot of the summer stuck in, I'm tired. I've been doing this for 30 years. It's just, I'm tired. And administrators, on top of that, administrators vary in terms of their true commitment to anti-racism and diversity. And that, you know, you could be pounding your head against a wall with someone who doesn't value any of this. So I would say self-care. You don't have to fight every battle every time. Figure out, start with what can I do that can improve things without adding a lot of burden on me. And then from there, who are my allies? Who are my true allies? And how can I partner with them? I think those are some things to think about.
And that's one thing, and that is to dovetail to say, you might think that what you're saying or doing isn't impacting at many different levels, but it might be, and it might just be with repetitive, consistent. Eventually, eureka, because I've seen it time and again. You know, you start to get discouraged, and just when that happens, you link up with your roadies and you get some support and you hang in there, and doggone it, if things haven't changed all the way around, praise God, I would say. So you never know. So don't give up. It's too important to give up.
Great words to kind of lead us right into our wrap up. We are, already over time, but I just want to thank you all for being here and to really remind you of the words of one of our key leaders in Aphasia Access, Dr. Nina Simmons-Mackey, who says that anyone can be a change agent. Change starts with you. Yesterday, I heard on the television that there is no vaccine against discrimination and racism. And I want to end with the words of Atul Gawande, who said, better is possible. It does not take genius. It takes diligence. It takes moral clarity. It takes ingenuity. And above all, it takes a willingness to try. So here's to the collective power of our communities to really make more of this moment, make the most of this moment, and be more for our clients, our students who are watching us, and certainly for our peers and professionals who've endured many barriers to success. Thank you for joining me on this fabulous conversation. Thank you to Aphasia Access, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you to my panelists for being here.